Welcome to Out of Court and Out of Conflict, presented by Wasinger Law Office.
Hello and welcome to Out of Court and Out of Conflict, your guide to estate law and probate solutions by Wasinger Law Office. Today, we unravel legal complexities and secure your family's legacy with experienced attorney Matt Wasinger. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and today's episode is The Investor's Edge, Legal Considerations for Florida Investment Properties. Matt, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me back, Kevin.
Absolutely. So what are the key differences between purchasing a primary residence and an investment property in Florida? Obviously, lots of people buy second homes or investment properties in Florida. So how's that differ?
Well, I mean, from a strictly closing standpoint, the differences aren't that drastic. You're still running a title search. You're still getting a title policy in most cases, at least if you choose to, and you're not paying straight cash. And the process itself is relatively similar. Where it differs, especially in Florida, is the difference between your primary residence, which they call homestead in Florida, and investment property, which is basically any other property that's not your homestead. Florida law has an extreme homestead protection that not all other states have, some, or at least to the extent that Florida has. And you don't have that with an investment property. So when you're dealing with investment properties, there could be differences in the amount of funding you need too. If you're pulling out a loan, there's a whole bunch of different caveats and different programs for home buyers buying a primary residence that don't necessarily exist for investment properties. So you might have to have more as a down payment for those investment properties. The other thing is homeowners insurance. There's a different kind of homeowners insurance you need for a property that especially if it's an investment that you're renting versus living in. And the protections, the terms, all of that's different.
Okay. And as far as due diligence goes with investment property transactions, what type of information do you usually find when you properly do your research and due diligence?
Well, for residential properties, it's title searches showing any potential liens, unpermitted additions, boundary survey issues. Those are the main things when it's a residential property. You're still doing the same things you would be buying for personally. But if you're buying a commercial investment property, then there's extra due diligence that you want to do. You want to make sure that you're getting all of the maintenance records from the current owner, the rent roll, how many people are renting from that property, if there are any, what the market rents are versus what they're charging or what they're getting, how empty is it? How much is unoccupied? And if there have been any major claims, is the maintenance kept up? Are the air conditioners in good shape? Is the electrical in good shape? Are there, what's going on? There's extra due diligence you want to do with a commercial property that you don't necessarily need to do with a residential property unless you're buying someone else's rental property that they're flipping over. It's a multifamily property. So more than one unit, more of like an apartment complex. So it really depends on the type of property you're purchasing, but more or less you're still running the same searches. You just expand the information that you need in due diligence on a commercial property or a multifamily property to better understand the finances of that property and what you're getting into. Because you never want to buy a property and overpay for it and then not be able to cover what your monthly costs are going to be. Right. If you get in there and realize that there's all this deferred maintenance that needs to be done, the rents weren't quite as advertised, or it's more unoccupied than you thought, things like that can drive up the cost of the entire process that you may or may not have budgeted for.
What are some of the other common mistakes you see real estate investors make when purchasing an investment property?
There's a lot of real estate investors out there that are relatively green in the process. And the number one thing they do is especially if they're armed with cash, they just go buy properties and they don't run a simple title search. I've had people over the years that went, especially back through 2008 and 2000, more or less 12, 14, when the housing market crashed, and all sorts of HOAs were foreclosing on these properties, meaning they weren't getting paid. So they filed a lien and they went and foreclosed on the property to get the property given back to the HOA because they weren't getting paid. Well, most of the time, HOA fees are much less than a mortgage on a property, right? Let's say you buy a property for $200,000 and your HOA fees are $100 a month. Well, your mortgage has first priority in Florida, meaning that's the number one top top lien on the property. There's in order. And the HOA is typically two, sometimes could be even three in terms of if there's a second mortgage or a home equity line also on the house or the property, and then an HOA or condo association of some kind. They will foreclose, and back then they did a lot more frequently. They would foreclose, and then they would have a foreclosure auction in Florida where anyone can bid on the property. And I had people that I had to help in getting these situations where they were just buying the property at foreclosure, assuming that a foreclosure cleans out all liens. But they didn't run a title search on these properties, knowing that there's a first mortgage on the property. So they buy these properties with, let's say, $10,000 at foreclosure auction for an HOA. And then all of a sudden they get in there and realize, oh, wait, there's another foreclosure going. The first mortgage is foreclosing. And now you have 8 months to try to make any money off that property you can, or you got to figure out a way to pay off that first mortgage. And unless you have all that money planned out ahead of time, you're just going to lose that property once the first mortgage forecloses. And that was happening a lot at the time. Actually, and some people were doing it strategically. They were buying a whole bunch of those, hiring attorneys to fight the foreclosure and drag it out so they could make as much money as possible before losing the property. Title searches are what's going to show you what's going on, and you need to do that, especially when you're dealing with foreclosure auction purchases, short sale purchases, things like that. You don't know what else is out there and what could be a problem for you that you may or may not have the money for, or just really overbuy because you don't understand what the total cost actually is going to be.
I know you mentioned that, especially, there's, new buyers that buy with cash. I know out here, I live in Colorado. A lot of investors buy with cash. It's how they get a lot of the hotter properties, if you will. But when it comes to financing for investment properties, is it different from traditional home financing?
Yeah, and typically there's home financing, there's been a lot of, whether it's government programs, the VA, FHA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, which are quasi-government programs that try to give benefits to home buyers buying their primary residence, right? So there's maybe a lower amount of a down payment due. Instead of 20%, it's only 10 or 5% even in some cases. With a investment property, typically there are still some programs to allow you to get creative with financing, and there's more financing options out there because you can take a lot of hard money to go ahead and buy those things. But you're going to have to show that you have either the money or the ability to handle this second investment property and the income to continue to run it long enough for whatever mortgage you're taking out is coming. So that's the main difference. Is you may owe more on a down payment when it comes to financing, and your financing options are going to be pretty different in most cases, although there are some overlap in depending on what kind of property you're buying.
Okay. And then what is the process for transferring ownership of an investment property in Florida? Are there specific legal steps that are essential in this type of transaction?
If you own the investment property in your own name, it's no different than any other property. You're just executing a deed, right? If you own it as an LLC, with other partners, then that changes the calculus again. So, depending on what the operating agreement, as we talked about in our, prior episodes, the operating agreement says you might have to have everybody in the LLC sign. You might have only one person willing to sign and sell these assets of the LLC, which is the property. So transfer becomes a little more complicated when you have a business owning the property, the investment property. Other things in Florida that you can do, you can set up real estate investment trusts, which is that you hire a company basically to be the trustee, set up a trust. You hire a company to be the trustee of your property, so it takes your name off of it. And then let's say your business, your LLC is the beneficiary of that trust. That way you can change beneficiaries, owners of that LLC and that property without having to file a new deed because it's owned by the trust and the LLC is the beneficiary of it. And some people like that for a whole bunch of different reasons other than, if they've got a big group that's buying a whole bunch of different properties and people moving in and out, then they can set it up that way. Other people like it because it helps keep their name off of the deed, off of the public records that they actually own it. It's a trustee's name only, so people have to contact the trustee to figure it out. So it provides a little bit of anonymity to the process. But generally speaking, transferring ownership is deed related, and it just depends on how many people are involved and how the business is structured to allow the sale to go through.
Are there any unique laws or requirements when it comes to renting or leasing a property that you buy in Florida that you think investors should know about?
Yeah, I mean, the rise of Airbnb has made a big difference in most places for renting properties. Anything in, like, I'll just use Orange County as an example, where I live in Florida. Anything under 6-month lease is considered a short-term rental, and there's additional taxes that might be in the city and the county that you're in that you're going to owe if you're renting that out. So I'm renting to you for $1,000 a month, and it's only for 3 months. Well, the city finds out, they're going to want their 15, 12, whatever percentage of tax on each one of those months is. That's either coming out of the money you have if you didn't plan ahead, or you've got to raise the rent enough to make sure that you're covering those taxes to get the number that you want. So Airbnbs or short-term rentals, some people just assume, oh, I can just start and do anyone month to month. Well, you got to check your local county and city to find out if short-term rentals, what that exactly means, because it can be different, whether that's 6 months, whether it's 9 months, whether it's a year, whether they're allowed to do that or not, and whether there's going to be extra taxes, which is going to determine how much you really should be charging for rent, depending on what your expenses are and what you're going to have to pay out.
I've heard before people say that, like a lot of times people in a neighborhood, neighbors or whatever, don't love it when people use their house as an Airbnb. There's constantly new people coming in and out and
Right.
all that. And no one around here does that to my knowledge, but I totally can understand why that would be an issue. Are there any sort of protections, laws? Are there any sort of zoning requirements when it comes to that to protect people who might not want to see a revolving door of people going into their house next door?
Yeah, just like the taxes that you're going to have for short-term rentals, I should clarify, there's a difference between renting short-term, like on a single-family property, versus a straight Airbnb method. I use Airbnb because that's the most commonly used situation for short-term rentals. But so my rental property, I'm only renting for a couple months. I'm still supposed to be paying in those short-term rental taxes. But depending on the city, they might not allow Airbnbs at all. They'll allow you to rent month to month potentially to tenants, but they're not letting you run, you can rent this for 3 days, you can rent this for 5 days and go on and on like that. There's specific prohibitions to that in a lot of different places. So just like checking for taxes, you got to check to find out if it's even allowed where you are, if you're buying something strictly for an Airbnb purpose, for sure.
Yeah, which I think a lot of people do these days. They do think about that, especially if you're in a cool area that people want to go to, on the beach for you or in the mountains for me. I think that happens a lot more. So I totally understand why that would be. Are there any recent changes in Florida real estate law that could impact investment property transactions?
Well, not just investment property transactions, but they've changed the way realtors are allowed to earn commission.
I know all about that.
Yeah. So now buyers are required to get their own separate agreement with a realtor or sign an agreement with the seller's realtor before they even start seeing these properties. At least that's how some of the people are running it. And the way they've changed commissions now, it's a little more negotiable depending on the party, instead of kind of the consistent flat percentage that everyone used to charge. So, anytime you're dealing with investment properties and you're dealing with, your investments itself, knowing and getting the right realtor or getting the right information about how you need to handle this thing is the difference between maybe getting a property and not, right? Or getting it at a figure that makes sense, because you don't want all of a sudden a new fee popping up that you weren't prepared for. So doing those things ahead of time, especially with the new realtor compensation and rules around that, is a big deal. The other thing is you got to think about is, LLCs, businesses aren't allowed to claim when it comes to primary residences. So if you're buying a property as an investment, then start living there and it's in an LLC, you can't claim homestead through the LLC. You have to have it in your own name. Florida doesn't allow you to claim homestead without it being in your name, or anyone else can claim it without their name being on the deed. So that's a key thing to think about. If people are like, I'm buying this as an investment, but then I'm going to live in it, and I'm going to, I want to claim homestead at the same time. It's probably not going to happen, or you're going to get in trouble for some homestead fraud if you find a way around that, which can be an expensive cost, because in Florida, homestead limits the rise of your value of your property for tax purposes to 3% at most year over year. So whatever your purchase price is, once you claim homestead, it's the cost, the value of taxes is only going to be determined on the value of the property of 3% increases. So, for instance, if the housing market, especially after COVID, jumped significantly, right? So your house was worth $100,000, all of a sudden it's worth $200,000. The Florida on a homestead property is only going to charge you taxes on $103,000 because it's only gone up 3% of that $100,000, right? Instead of the $200,000, which is not true in all states. So the homestead is pretty key in Florida, along with other protections it provides. But in investment property versus homestead, those are the things you got to be paying attention to.
Definitely. Good advice as always, Matt. Well, thanks for tuning in to Out of Court and Out of Conflict with experienced attorney Matt Wasinger. For more information or to connect with Matt, visit wasingerlawoffice.com, and please like and subscribe to our channel. We love having you here. Matt, I loved having you here. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Kevin. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more amazing videos like this one.